The sound of a gavel striking wood echoed through the dusty square of Silver Creek, Montana Territory. 1876. Grace Winters stood on the makeshift auction platform, her honey-blonde hair matted with dust, tears streaming silently down her dirt-streaked face. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope that bit into her skin, a stark symbol of how far she had fallen from the life she once knew in Boston. $500 for this fine specimen. Can I get $500? The auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying across the crowd of miners, ranchers, and drifters who had gathered for the territorial auction. Look at her, gentlemen. Young, healthy, and educated too. She'll cook, clean, and maybe warm your bed if you treat her right. Crude laughter rippled through the crowd. Grace closed her eyes, unable to bear the leering faces. 3 weeks ago, she had been traveling west with her uncle, her only living relative, to start a new life after her parents' death from influenza. Then came the ambush, ruthless bandits who killed her uncle and took everything they owned. They'd sold her to a slave trader who didn't care that indentured servitude was illegal in most territories. Here in this lawless frontier town, no one seemed to care about such legal distinctions. 500. Do I hear 550? The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip in the afternoon heat. 600, a voice called out, slurred, drunken. Grace forced her eyes open to see a pot-bellied man with yellowed teeth and filthy clothes leering at her. She shuddered involuntarily. 700, came another bid, this one from a silver-haired gentleman whose cold eyes appraised her like cattle. 800, called the drunk again, swaying on his feet. The bidding continued, each number hammering another nail into the coffin of Grace's hopes. She had nothing, no money, no family, no friends in this wild territory. She'd heard stories of what happened to women sold this way. Some became little more than slaves on remote ranches, others forced into brothels in mining towns. $1,500. The auctioneer's voice rose in excitement at the unexpected high bid. A hush fell over the crowd as they turned to see who had offered such a sum. Grace followed their gaze, her tear-filled eyes settling on a tall figure at the back of the gathering. The man stepped forward, the crowd parting for him like water. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but Grace could see the strong line of his jaw, covered in a few days' worth of stubble. He wore a simple cotton shirt under a leather vest, well-worn denim pants, and boots that had seen many miles. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the weapon nestled in its holster gleaming in the sunlight. 1,500 going once. The auctioneer called, looking around eagerly for a higher bid. 2,000, shouted the silver-haired man, his face flushed with anger. The newcomer's expression didn't change. He simply reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. 3,000, he said, his voice deep and steady. The crowd gasped. $3,000 was a fortune in the territory, enough to buy a decent spread of land or a small business. 3,000 going once, going twice. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air, his eyes darting hopefully around the crowd. The silver-haired man glared but remained silent. Sold, to the gentleman in the back. Grace felt her knees weaken. What fate awaited her now? Would this stranger be kinder than the others who had bid on her, or had she merely been purchased by a man who could afford to pay more for his cruelties? The stranger approached the platform, boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each deliberate step. He handed the pouch to the auctioneer, who quickly counted the money with greedy fingers. All here, the auctioneer confirmed, handing Grace's rope to her new owner. The man took the rope, but immediately produced a knife from his belt. Grace flinched, drawing back as far as her restraints would allow. Instead of threatening her, however, he sliced through the bonds on her wrists in one swift motion. "My name is Finn Callahan," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. His eyes, a striking shade of blue that reminded Grace of the ocean she'd left behind in Boston, met hers directly. "And from this moment on, you'll only know joy." Grace stared at him, uncomprehending. The man Finn gently placed his jacket around her shoulders. "Come with me, miss," he said, louder now for others to hear. "My wagon's this way." Still stunned, Grace followed him through the parting crowd. Some men muttered disapprovingly, others watched with obvious envy. The silver-haired man who had bid against Finn stared at them with open hostility. "You can't just free her, Callahan," he called out. "That's not how things work here." Finn turned slowly, his hand resting casually near his holster. "I paid for her fair and square, Harrison. What I do with my property is my business." The man named Harrison spat on the ground but made no move to stop them. Finn guided Grace to a wagon hitched to two strong horses at the edge of town. "Get in," he said, helping her up to the seat. "We need to put some distance between us and Silver Creek before nightfall." Grace found her voice at last. "Why?" she asked, her throat dry and scratchy from crying. "Why did you do that?" Finn climbed up beside her and took the reins. "No decent person should be sold like cattle," he said simply. He clicked his tongue and the horses started forward, the wagon wheels creaking beneath them. "But the money, $3,000. "Just money," Finn replied, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "I've been saving for years. Was going to buy more land, expand my ranch." He glanced at her. This seemed more important. "What do you want from me?" Grace asked, still suspicious despite his kind words. Men didn't spend fortunes on women without expecting something in return. "Nothing," he said. "Once we're far enough from town, you can decide where you want to go. I'll help you get there safely." Grace stared at his profile as he guided the horses onto the main trail heading west. His features were weathered by sun and wind, but he couldn't be much past 30. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though his expression now was serious. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted quietly. "My uncle and I were traveling to Oregon when we were attacked. He was killed. I have no other family." Finn nodded slowly. "I'm sorry to hear that. What's your name?" "Grace. Grace Winters." "Well, Miss Winters, I have a small ranch about a day's ride from here. You're welcome to stay there until you figure out what you want to do next. I have a cabin for hired hands that's empty right now. You'd have your privacy." Grace studied him, trying to determine if there was any hint of deception in his offer. She found none, only a straightforward kindness that seemed almost out of place in this harsh territory. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan," she finally said. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Finn," he corrected. "And there's no debt. I did what any decent person would do." As the wagon rolled away from Silver Creek, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced since the ambush that had claimed her uncle's life, a small flicker of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't facing it with complete despair. The rest of the day passed in relative silence as Finn guided the wagon along the trail. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks or name distant mountains. Grace found his voice soothing, the casual conversation helping to ease her anxiety. As dusk approached, he pulled the wagon off the main trail. "We'll camp here for the night," he said, stopping near a small stream. "There's good water and enough shelter from the wind." Grace watched as Finn efficiently set up camp, unloading bedrolls and starting a small fire. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to life on the trail. "Are you hungry?" he asked, rummaging in a provision box in the back of the wagon. Grace nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow feeling in her stomach. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a proper meal. Finn produced some dried beef, beans, and a small sack of cornmeal. It's not fancy, but it'll fill your belly, he said, beginning to prepare a simple stew. Can I help? Grace asked, stepping closer to the fire. Finn looked up, seeming surprised by the offer. Sure, you can cut up these potatoes if you'd like. Grace took the knife he offered and began to work, grateful for the task. The simple act of preparing food made her feel human again after weeks of being treated like property. Were you really planning to buy land with that money? She asked after a while. Finn nodded, stirring the pot of beans. Been saving for 5 years. My place is small, just enough for me and a few dozen head of cattle. Always wanted to expand, he shrugged. Land will still be there next year, or the year after. I can't imagine having that much money, let alone giving it away, Grace said quietly. Money's just a tool, Miss Winters. Sometimes there are more important things. He looked up at her. Like human dignity, Grace felt a lump form in her throat. My uncle used to say something similar. He was a good man. Sounds like he was, Finn agreed. How'd you end up out here? You don't talk like you're from the territories. I'm from Boston, Grace explained, passing him the cut potatoes. My parents died last winter. Influenza. Uncle William was my only family. He'd been writing to us about opportunities in Oregon, so I decided to join him. She swallowed hard. We were 3 weeks into our journey when the bandits came. Finn added the potatoes to the pot. The territories can be dangerous. Too many men who have forgotten what civilization means. He hesitated. Those men who took you, did they? They didn't harm me that way, Grace said quickly, understanding his unspoken question. They seemed to think they'd get more money if they sold me. Intact. Relief crossed Finn's features. Small mercies, I suppose. He stirred the stew again. This'll be ready soon. There's coffee, too, if you'd like some. They ate in comfortable silence as darkness settled around them. The stew was simple, but the most delicious thing Grace had tasted in weeks. After they'd finished, Finn showed her where she could wash up at the stream. I'll sleep on this side of the fire, he said when she returned, indicating one of the bedrolls he'd set up. You take the other. It's a clear night, but if it looks like rain, we'll string up the canvas. Grace settled onto the bedroll, pulling the blanket up to her chin. She watched as Finn checked on the horses one last time before adding wood to the fire. Mr. Callahan Finn, she corrected herself. Thank you, not just for buying my freedom, but for treating me like a person. Finn looked at her across the flickering flames. Get some rest, Miss Winters. We've got a long ride tomorrow. Grace closed her eyes, listening to the crackling fire and the soft sounds of the night. For the first time in weeks, she fell asleep without fear. Morning came with the chirping of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves. Grace opened her eyes to find Finn already up, tending to a small fire with coffee brewing. Good morning, he said, noticing she was awake. Sleep well. Grace sat up, pushing her tangled hair from her face. Better than I have in a long time, she admitted. There's coffee ready and some biscuits from yesterday. He handed her a tin cup of the steaming liquid. We should reach my place by nightfall if we make good time. Grace accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. What's your ranch like? She asked, curious about the place that would be her temporary home. Finn's face softened slightly. Nothing fancy. Main house is small but solid. Got a barn, corral, and the bunkhouse where you'll stay. Land's good, though, creek running through it. Plenty of grass for the cattle. There was pride in his voice when he added, built most of it myself over the last 7 years. You've been in Montana territory that long? Came west after the war, he said, packing up their bedrolls. Didn't have much reason to stay in Missouri. Wanted to start fresh somewhere new. Grace helped him break camp, and soon they were back on the trail. The terrain gradually changed as they traveled, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine trees. In the distance, mountains rose against the blue sky. "It's beautiful," Grace said, taking in the landscape. "That it is," Finn agreed. "First time I saw these hills, I knew I'd found home." They stopped briefly at midday to rest the horses and eat a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack. Grace found herself watching Finn as he checked the horses' hooves and adjusted their harnesses. There was something comforting about his methodical movements, the quiet competence with which he handled everything. "Were you in the army during the war?" she asked as they continued their journey. Finn nodded. "Union cavalry, enlisted in '62, fought till Appomattox." "My father supported the Union cause," Grace said. "He was too old to fight, but he contributed money and supplies." "It was a hard time," Finn said simply, and Grace sensed he didn't want to say more about it. As the afternoon wore on, Grace noticed Finn becoming more alert, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape more frequently. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Just being cautious," he replied. "We're getting close to disputed territory. Some tribes still claim this land." "Indians." Grace couldn't keep the alarm from her voice. "Blackfoot, mostly. They generally leave settlers alone these days, but it pays to be watchful." He patted the rifle secured beside him. "Don't worry, Miss Winters, we'll be fine." Despite his reassurance, Grace felt tension creeping into her shoulders. She'd heard stories about Indian attacks back east, though she'd always suspected they were exaggerated to sell newspapers. "Have you had trouble with them before?" she asked. "Not in a few years," Finn said. "There's an uneasy peace now. They stay north of Miller's Creek, ranchers stay south." He glanced at her. "The real trouble comes from men like Harrison back in Silver Creek. They're the ones pushing for more land, stirring up conflicts." They traveled on, the shadows lengthening as the sun began its descent. Just as Grace was beginning to wonder how much farther they had to go, Finn pointed to a distant valley. "There it is," he said. "Callahan Ranch." From this distance, Grace could make out a small cluster of buildings nestled among trees near a winding creek. As they drew closer, the details became clearer: a modest log house with a stone chimney, a large barn, and several smaller outbuildings. A corral held a few horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the hillsides. "It's lovely," Grace said sincerely. After weeks of uncertainty, the sight of the peaceful homestead brought unexpected emotion to her throat. Finn's expression softened with pride. "It's not much compared to what you probably knew in Boston, but it's home." They followed a well-worn track down into the valley. As they approached, a dog came bounding out to meet them, barking excitedly. "That's Scout," Finn said as the black and white border collie raced alongside the wagon. "Best cattle dog in the territory." A moment later, a man emerged from the barn, shading his eyes against the setting sun. "That's Gabriel Martinez," Finn explained. "He helps me run the place." Gabriel was shorter than Finn but solidly built, with dark hair and a thick mustache. He watched their approach with evident curiosity. "Didn't expect you back so soon, boss," he called as the wagon came to a stop in front of the house. His eyes moved to Grace, questions clear in his expression. "Had a change of plans," Finn said, jumping down from the wagon. He turned to help Grace down. "Gabriel, this is Miss Grace Winters. She'll be staying in the bunkhouse for a while." Gabriel touched the brim of his hat. "Madam," he said politely, though his eyes darted between her and Finn with obvious confusion. "Miss Winters ran into some trouble on her way west," Finn explained, his tone suggesting Gabriel shouldn't ask for details. "I offered her a place to stay until she decides her next move." Understanding dawned in Gabriel's eyes. "The bunkhouse is clean," he said to Grace. "Not fancy, but it's comfortable enough." "Thank you," Grace replied. "I'm grateful for the shelter." "Gabriel, can you see to the horses?" Finn asked. "I'll show Miss Winters to the bunkhouse." As Gabriel led the team away, Finn collected Grace's small bundle of belongings, just a worn carpet bag, containing the few items the bandits had allowed her to keep. "This way," he said, leading her toward a small cabin about 50 yards from the main house. Like Gabriel said, it's simple, but it's clean and dry. The bunkhouse was indeed basic, a single room with 4 narrow beds, a small table with chairs, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. The wood was rough-hewn, but the floor was swept clean, and the windows had proper glass panes. "No one's using it now," Finn explained. "I usually only hire extra hands during roundup and branding season." Grace set her bag on one of the beds. After weeks of captivity and sleeping on the ground, the simple cabin seemed like luxury. "There's a wash house behind the main house," Finn continued, "and you're welcome to take your meals with us. Gabriel's a fair cook, though he'll deny it if you mention it." His lips quirked in a small smile. "I can cook," Grace offered. "It's the least I can do to repay your kindness." Finn studied her for a moment. "You don't owe me anything, Miss Winters, but if you want to help out, I won't stop you." He glanced out the window at the setting sun. "Supper's usually around sundown. I'll come get you when it's ready." After he left, Grace sat on the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden turn her fortunes had taken. Just yesterday, she had been standing on an auction block, facing a future of servitude or worse. Now she was safe, at least for the moment, in this peaceful valley with a man who had spent his life savings to rescue a stranger. She unpacked her meager belongings: a change of clothes, a hairbrush, a small Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. Everything else had been taken by the bandits. When Finn returned to escort her to supper, Grace had washed her face and hands at the small basin provided and done her best to make herself presentable. "I'm afraid I don't have much in the way of clothing," she apologized, smoothing down her wrinkled dress. "There's a trading post about 10 miles from here," Finn said. "We can ride over tomorrow if you'd like, get you whatever you need." The main house was simply furnished but comfortable, with solid wooden furniture and a large stone fireplace. The main room served as both kitchen and dining area, with a couple of doors leading to what Grace assumed were bedrooms. Gabriel was setting a pot of stew on the table when they entered. He nodded politely to Grace, but seemed unsure how to interact with her. "Smells good," Finn commented, pulling out a chair for Grace. The meal was simple but hearty: venison stew, cornbread, and coffee. The men ate with the focused efficiency of those who viewed food primarily as fuel, but they answered Grace's tentative questions about the ranch and the surrounding area. "Been a good year so far," Gabriel told her. "Calving went well, and the grass is better than last summer." "We run about 60 head of cattle," Finn added. "Small operation compared to some, but the quality's good. We've been building up the herd each year." As they ate, Grace studied the two men. Gabriel was clearly deferential to Finn, but there was an ease between them that spoke of long acquaintance and mutual respect. They moved around each other with the comfortable familiarity of men who had worked together for years. After supper, Gabriel excused himself to check on a new calf born the previous day. Finn poured another cup of coffee and sat back in his chair. "Tomorrow I'll show you around the place," he said. "Let you get your bearings." "I'd like that," Grace replied, "and I meant what I said about helping." "I'm not afraid of work." Finn nodded slowly. "I believe that, but take a few days to rest first. You've been through a lot." Grace wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you really do it?" "Buy my freedom, I mean. $3,000 is." "It's a fortune." Finn was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I had a sister, Fiona. She was 2 years younger than me. When I went off to war, she stayed behind with our parents in Missouri. He took a breath. In '63, raiders came through our town. Bushwhackers, they called themselves. Fighting for the Confederacy, they said, but they were just thieves and murderers. Grace sat very still, sensing the weight of what he was about to tell her. They killed my father when he tried to protect our farm. Took my mother and Fiona. His jaw tightened. By the time word reached me and I got leave to go home, it was too late. Found my mother's body in a ditch outside of town. Never found Fiona. I'm so sorry, Grace whispered. Later I heard stories about women being sold to brothels or to men in remote places who wanted wives but couldn't find willing ones. He finally looked at her directly. When I saw you on that platform, I couldn't walk away, not again. Grace felt tears well in her eyes. Thank you for telling me. Finn cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with having revealed so much. It's getting late. I should let you get some rest. He walked her back to the bunkhouse, carrying a lantern to light their way. At the door, he handed her the light. If you need anything in the night, the main house is right there. Don't hesitate to come knock. Thank you, Finn, for everything. He nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the house, his tall figure soon swallowed by the darkness. Grace closed the door and prepared for bed, her mind spinning with all that had happened. As she lay in the narrow but comfortable bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Montana night, she thought about Finn Callahan and the tragedy that had shaped him. Perhaps that explained the sadness she sometimes glimpsed behind his eyes, the careful way he kept people at a distance. Sleep came easier than she expected, deep and dreamless in the safety of her new sanctuary. The following days established a routine that Grace found comforting after the chaos and uncertainty of recent weeks. True to his word, Finn took her to the trading post, where he insisted on purchasing fabric for new dresses, undergarments, a sturdy pair of boots, and other necessities. You can't work around a ranch in city clothes, he said when she protested the expense. The trading post was run by a gruff but kind-hearted couple named Frank and Martha Sullivan. Martha's eyes had widened when Finn briefly explained that Grace was staying at his ranch after losing her uncle during their journey west. Poor dear, Martha had said, pulling Grace aside while Finn discussed cattle prices with Frank. You're lucky Finn found you. He's a good man if a bit closed off. She lowered her voice further. Handsome too, though I reckon you've noticed that. Grace had blushed and changed the subject, but she couldn't deny that Martha was right. There was something undeniably attractive about Finn Callahan, with his quiet strength and unexpected kindness. But she quickly pushed such thoughts aside. Her situation was precarious enough without developing feelings for her rescuer. Back at the ranch, Grace insisted on making herself useful. She took over much of the cooking, using the skills her mother had taught her to prepare meals that soon had both men looking forward to mealtimes. She learned to tend the kitchen garden, gathered eggs from the small chicken coop, and even helped Gabriel mend fences when an extra pair of hands was needed. Finn was often busy with ranch work, but he made time each evening to check on her, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book from his modest collection, wildflowers he'd picked while checking on distant cattle, or berries he'd gathered from bushes along the creek. One evening about 2 weeks after her arrival, Grace was hanging laundry behind the bunkhouse when Finn approached, leading his horse. I need to ride out to check the north pasture, he said. Thought you might like to come along. It's a pretty ride, and you haven't seen that part of the ranch yet. Grace readily agreed, grateful for the chance to explore more of the beautiful valley. Finn helped her mount behind him, his hands strong and steady as he lifted her onto the horse's back. "Hold on," he instructed as they set off at an easy trot. Grace tentatively placed her hands on his waist, acutely aware of the solid warmth of him. As they rode up into the hills, the landscape opened before them, rolling meadows dotted with wildflowers, stands of pine trees, and in the distance, the snow-capped peaks of mountains. "It's breathtaking," she said as they paused at the top of a rise. Finn glanced back at her, a small smile touching his lips. "Worth saving for, isn't it?" They dismounted near a creek to let the horse drink. Finn spread his coat on a flat rock for Grace to sit on, then sat beside her, both of them gazing out over the valley below. "How did you find this place?" Grace asked. "Luck, mostly," Finn replied. "Was working as a trail hand after the war, driving cattle up from Texas. Passed through this valley and couldn't get it out of my mind. Came back the next year with what savings I had and staked my claim. You've built something wonderful here." Finn looked at her, his blue eyes searching her face. "It's been lonely at times," he admitted. "Worth it, but lonely." "You have Gabriel," Grace pointed out. "Gabriel's a good man, a good friend, but he has family over in Helena he visits when he can. Talks about saving enough to buy his own place someday." Finn picked up a small stone and tossed it into the creek. Can't blame him for wanting more. Grace was struck by the hint of vulnerability in his voice. This strong, capable man who had faced war and wilderness was, at heart, as susceptible to loneliness as anyone. "What about you?" he asked after a moment. "What did you want from life before everything changed?" Grace considered the question. "I never really thought about it much. In Boston, my future seemed predetermined. I'd marry someone from a good family, have children, maintain a respectable home." She smiled ruefully. "My mother was already introducing me to suitable young men before she fell ill. And now. Grace looked out over the valley, feeling the warm Montana sun on her face and the cool breeze in her hair. "Now I think I want something different, something more authentic." Finn nodded slowly as if her answer satisfied something in him. They sat in companionable silence for a while longer before remounting and continuing their inspection of the north pasture. As they rode back to the ranch house, Grace found herself reluctant for the outing to end. There was something magical about this day, this moment, riding through the golden afternoon light with Finn's solid presence in front of her. The next morning, Gabriel announced that he needed to make a trip into town for supplies and to send some letters. He would be gone overnight. "You'll be all right here?" he asked Grace, glancing between her and Finn with what might have been concern or perhaps something else entirely. "Of course," Grace assured him. "I have plenty to keep me busy." After Gabriel departed, Grace spent the morning baking bread and preparing a stew for dinner. Finn was out checking fences but returned at midday, bringing with him a brace of rabbits he'd shot. "Thought these might make a good supper," he said, hanging them from a hook on the porch. "I'll clean them," Grace offered. She had watched Gabriel dress game several times and felt confident she could manage the task. Finn raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll be in the barn if you need help." Grace set to work with determined concentration, wanting to prove her usefulness. She was so focused on her task that she didn't notice the approaching riders until they were nearly at the house. Looking up, she saw 3 men on horseback coming down the trail. Something about their appearance sent a chill through her. They rode with a loose, arrogant posture that reminded her uncomfortably of the men who had attacked her uncle's wagon. Setting aside the knife, Grace quickly wiped her hands and hurried toward the barn. Finn was inside, repairing a saddle. "Riders coming," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. 3 men. Finn was on his feet immediately, reaching for the rifle that was never far from his side. "Stay in here," he instructed, moving to the barn door. From her position just inside, Grace could see Finn standing on the threshold, rifle held casually but ready. The three riders pulled up in front of the house, looking around with the calculating gaze of predators. "Afternoon," Finn called, his voice neutral but carrying a clear warning. "Something I can help you with," the leader, a lean man with a scar running down one cheek, smiled without warmth. "Just passing through looking for work. Heard you might be hiring." "Heard wrong," Finn replied. "Don't need any hands right now." The scarred man's eyes drifted past Finn to where Grace stood partially visible in the barn shadows. His smile widened, showing yellowed teeth. "That's a shame. Looks like you've got yourself a pretty little setup here." He nodded toward Grace. "Real pretty." Finn shifted slightly, blocking the man's view. "Like I said, I'm not hiring. Best move on." The second rider, a heavy-set man with a bushy beard, spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Ain't very hospitable, are you? Most folks offer travelers a drink at least." "I'm not most folks," Finn said evenly. "And you boys don't look like you're just passing through." The third rider, who had remained silent until now, laughed a harsh, grating sound. "Smart man. Maybe too smart." Tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Grace held her breath, one hand pressed against her mouth to stay silent. "I'll say it one more time," Finn said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Move on. Now." The scarred leader stared at Finn for a long moment, then at the rifle in his hands. Whatever he saw in Finn's stance or expression must have convinced him this wasn't a fight worth having, at least not yet. "Sure thing, mister. No offense meant." He gathered his reins. "We'll be seeing you around." The three men turned their horses and rode away, but not before the leader looked back over his shoulder, his eyes finding Grace in the barn shadows. The look he gave her made her skin crawl. When they were out of sight, Finn lowered his rifle and came to Grace's side. "You all right?" She nodded, though she was trembling slightly. "Who were they?" "Trouble," Finn said grimly. "Drifters, most likely, men who live by taking what isn't theirs." He guided her out of the barn, keeping a watchful eye on the trail. "They won't come back today, but they've marked this place now. We'll need to be careful." That night, despite Finn's assurances that the men wouldn't return immediately, he insisted Grace stay in the main house rather than the bunkhouse. "You can take my room," he said. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." Grace wanted to protest, but could see the determination in his eyes. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, bringing back the terror of the ambush that had claimed her uncle's life. Finn's bedroom was as straightforward as the man himself, a simple bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a lamp. The only personal touches were a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes and a small framed photograph on the dresser. Grace picked up the photograph, recognizing a younger Finn in a Union cavalry uniform. Beside him stood a pretty young woman with the same blue eyes as his Fiona, she realized, his lost sister. She carefully replaced the photograph and prepared for bed, borrowing one of Finn's shirts to sleep in since her nightgown was still in the bunkhouse. The shirt smelled of him leather, pine, and something indefinably masculine that made her heart beat a little faster. Sleep was elusive that night. Grace lay awake listening to the occasional creak of floorboards as Finn moved about in the main room, checking windows and doors. His vigilance both comforted and concerned her. Would those men return? And if they did, what would happen? In the dark quiet of Finn's room, another worry surfaced, one she had been pushing aside for days. What was her future here? Finn had offered her shelter until she decided what to do next, but she had no money, no family to turn to. The idea of leaving the ranch, of leaving Finn, caused an unexpected ache in her chest. Grace finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with faceless riders and auction blocks. She woke with a start sometime in the night, a cry caught in her throat. Before she could fully register where she was, the bedroom door opened and Finn appeared, concern etched on his features. "Grace, are you all right?" In his haste, he had dropped the formal Miss Winters he usually used. "Just a dream," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." Finn hesitated in the doorway, clearly torn between concern and propriety. "Can I get you anything? Water?" Grace shook her head, then changed her mind. "Actually, would you just sit with me for a moment?" He nodded, entering the room but leaving the door open behind him, a concession to propriety. He perched awkwardly on the edge of the bed, his tall frame looking out of place. "Want to tell me about the dream?" he asked quietly. Grace drew her knees up under the quilt, wrapping her arms around them. "It was about the day they took me, the auction." She swallowed hard. "But this time you didn't come." Finn's expression softened. He reached out tentatively, his hand hovering over hers before finally settling on the quilt beside her. "But I did come," he said gently, "and you're safe now." "For how long?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Finn looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes serious in the dim light. "For as long as you want to be," he said finally. "This can be your home, Grace, if you want it to be." The simple statement hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Grace felt something shift inside her, a settling, a recognition of truth. "I think I do want that," she whispered. Finn's hand moved, covering hers where it rested on the quilt. His palm was warm and calloused, the touch sending a tremor through her that had nothing to do with fear. "Then it's settled," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This is your home now." He stayed until she fell asleep again, his presence keeping the nightmares at bay. When Grace woke in the morning, he was gone, but the impression of his hand on hers lingered like a promise. Gabriel returned late that afternoon, bringing news from town that made Finn's expression darken. "Those men you mentioned," Gabriel said as they sat around the supper table. "They were in town, asking questions about this place, about who lives here." Finn's jaw tightened. "What kind of questions?" "Wanted to know if you had family here, how many hands you employ." Gabriel glanced at Grace. "Whether there were women on the property." Grace felt cold despite the warm evening. Finn must have noticed because he reached across the table and briefly squeezed her hand. "We'll be ready if they come back," he assured her. That night, and for several nights after, Finn insisted that both Grace and Gabriel stay in the main house. They took turns keeping watch, though Finn took the majority of the shifts despite Grace's protests. A week passed without incident, then another. Gradually, the tension began to ease. Grace returned to sleeping in the bunkhouse, though Finn still checked on her several times each night, his footsteps on the porch a comforting reminder of his vigilance. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. June gave way to July, bringing longer days and warmer temperatures. Grace found herself increasingly involved in the daily operations of the ranch, learning from both Finn and Gabriel. She discovered a natural affinity for the work, taking pride in her growing skills. More surprising was the way Finn began to open up to her. Their evenings often ended with conversations on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular colors. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, his experiences during the war, his dreams for the ranch. In turn, she shared memories of Boston, stories of her parents, and increasingly her hopes for the future she now imagined here, in this beautiful valley. One evening in late July, Finn suggested a ride to a special place he wanted to show her. They set out after supper, riding double on his favorite horse, a steady chestnut gelding named Buck. It's not far, Finn promised as they headed west from the ranch house. The sun was beginning its descent as they reached a high meadow carpeted with wildflowers. In the center stood a massive old pine tree, its branches spreading wide to create a natural canopy. "This is beautiful," Grace said as Finn helped her down from the horse. "It's my thinking spot," he admitted. "Come here when I need to sort things out in my head." They walked to the tree, where Finn spread a blanket he'd brought in his saddlebag. They sat side by side, looking out over the valley below. The ranch was visible in the distance, a peaceful cluster of buildings nestled among the trees. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," Finn said after a comfortable silence. "About what?" Grace asked, turning to look at him. His blue eyes met hers directly. "About you, about us." Grace's heart skipped a beat. "Us?" Finn took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "When I brought you here, I had no expectations beyond offering you sanctuary. But these past months—" He paused, searching for words. "You've become important to me, Grace. More important than I ever thought possible." Grace felt warmth spreading through her chest. "You've become important to me too, Finn." He reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. "I know your life hasn't turned out the way you planned, and I know I'm not the kind of man you probably imagined for yourself back in Boston. I'm just a rancher with rough hands and simple ways." "Finn," Grace began, but he gently squeezed her hand, asking her to let him finish. "But I care for you, Grace, more than care for you, and I'm wondering if maybe you might feel something similar for me." The vulnerability in his eyes nearly undid her. This strong, brave man who had faced war and wilderness was now laying his heart bare before her, his courage in this moment perhaps greater than any he had shown on a battlefield. "I do," Grace said softly. "I've been falling in love with you since the day you cut those ropes from my wrists." The words hung in the air between them, honest and true. Finn's expression transformed, hope and joy chasing away the uncertainty. "May I kiss you, Grace?" he asked, his voice husky. In answer, she leaned toward him, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded. His hand came up to cup her cheek, fingers threading into her hair as he deepened the kiss. When they finally parted, both breathless, Finn rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered. "I think I've loved you from the moment I saw you standing on that auction platform, refusing to let them break your spirit." Grace felt tears of happiness well in her eyes. "And I love you, Finn Callahan, my rescuer, my friend, my heart." They stayed in the meadow until twilight, talking, planning, sharing kisses and dreams. When they finally rode back to the ranch, something fundamental had changed between them. What had begun as rescue and gratitude had blossomed into something deeper, truer, a love born of shared experiences and genuine understanding. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of hammering. Curious, she dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Finn working on the bunkhouse, attaching new boards to the exterior wall. "What are you doing?" she asked, approaching with a cup of coffee for him. Finn accepted the drink gratefully, pausing in his work. "Fixing up the place. Thought we might turn it into a proper guest house, maybe even expand it someday." "Someday." He set down the hammer and turned to face her fully. "Grace, I know this is sudden and I'll understand if you want more time, but—" He took her hands in his. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Joy bubbled up inside her like a spring. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Finn, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm. When he set her down again, he kissed her soundly, uncaring that Gabriel might see from the barn where he was working. "I don't have a ring yet," Finn apologized. "But next time I go to Helena—" "I don't need a ring," Grace assured him. "Just you." Later that day, they shared their news with Gabriel, who grinned broadly and clapped Finn on the shoulder. "About time," he said. "Been watching you two dance around each other for weeks." They decided not to wait long for the wedding. The circuit preacher would be coming through the valley in 3 weeks, and Grace saw no reason to delay. She had fallen in love with Finn Callahan, and she wanted to begin their life together as soon as possible. Word of their engagement spread quickly among the scattered ranches and homesteads in the area. Martha Sullivan from the trading post immediately took it upon herself to help Grace prepare, offering fabric for a wedding dress and promising to order special items from Helena. "Every bride deserves something special," Martha insisted when Grace protested the expense. The weeks before the wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Grace worked on her dress in the evenings, using skills her mother had taught her to create something simple but beautiful from the fine cream-colored fabric Martha had provided. Finn, meanwhile, focused on improvements to the ranch house, building new furniture and expanding the kitchen. "For our future," he said when Grace commented on his industriousness. The way he looked at her when he said, "our future," made her heart swell with happiness. 2 days before the wedding, Grace was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her first thought was of the troublemakers who had visited months ago, but when she looked out the window, she saw Finn walking out to greet the riders with a welcoming wave. There were 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women, all dressed in their traveling best, despite the dust of the trail. Grace stepped onto the porch, curious about these unexpected visitors. "Grace," Finn called, gesturing for her to join him. "Come meet our guests." As she approached, she noticed that one of the women was heavily pregnant, supported by the arm of the tall man beside her. The other couple were older, perhaps in their 50s. "Grace, this is my cousin James and his wife Sarah," Finn said, indicating the younger couple. "And these are Sarah's parents, Harold and Elizabeth Turner. They've come all the way from Missouri for our wedding." Grace was momentarily speechless. Finn had mentioned writing to his cousin about their engagement but hadn't been sure if they would be able to make the journey. "We wouldn't miss it," James said, smiling broadly. He had the same blue eyes as Finn, though his hair was darker. When we got Finn's letter saying he'd finally found himself a bride, Ma insisted we come see for ourselves. "It's wonderful to meet you all," Grace said sincerely, touched that they had traveled so far. Sarah stepped forward, one hand resting on her rounded belly. "I'm so glad Finn's found someone," she said warmly. "He deserves happiness more than anyone I know." The arrival of family transformed the wedding from a simple ceremony into a true celebration. Harold and Elizabeth took to Grace immediately, treating her like a daughter they had known for years rather than days. Sarah, despite her advanced pregnancy, insisted on helping with the final preparations for the dress and the wedding feast. "Family takes care of family," she said simply when Grace protested that she should rest. The night before the wedding, Grace found herself sitting on the porch with Elizabeth while the men smoked and talked nearby. "Finn was always special," Elizabeth told her, her voice soft with memory. "Even as a boy, he had a kindness in him that set him apart. After the war, after what happened to his sister and parents, we feared that kindness might be lost." She patted Grace's hand. "But I can see it's still there when he looks at you." Grace swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I'm so grateful to have found him." Elizabeth smiled knowingly. "Or perhaps he found you, dear. Sometimes life works that way, bringing us exactly what we need just when we need it most." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the Montana sky a brilliant blue that matched Finn's eyes. The ceremony was to be held under the great pine tree in the meadow where Finn had first declared his love. Gabriel and James had ridden out early to prepare the site, setting up benches borrowed from neighboring ranches, and decorating the area with wildflowers gathered from the surrounding hills. By mid-morning, guests began to arrive, ranchers and their families from miles around, coming to witness the union of Finn Callahan and his bride, Grace, dressed in the main house with Sarah and Elizabeth's help. The dress they had created together was simple but elegant cream-colored cotton with delicate embroidery around the neckline and hem. Martha Sullivan had contributed a length of lace for the veil, which Elizabeth carefully pinned to Grace's honey blonde hair, now arranged in soft curls. "You look beautiful, dear," Elizabeth said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Sarah, who had insisted on making a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with a blue ribbon, handed it to Grace with a smile. "Finn won't know what hit him." When it was time, Harold came to escort Grace to the meadow. The guests had gathered beneath the pine tree, where the preacher, a kind-faced man named Reverend Johnson, waited with Finn and Gabriel, who stood as his best man. Finn turned as Grace approached on Harold's arm. The look on his face, wonder, love, and absolute certainty, was one Grace knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Johnson began as Grace took her place beside Finn, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When it came time for the vows, Finn took Grace's hands in his voice steady and sure. "I, Finnegan James Callahan, take you, Grace Elizabeth Winters, to be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Grace repeated the traditional words, her voice clear despite the emotion welling in her throat. Then Finn surprised her by adding words of his own. "Grace, when I found you, you were in tears, facing a future no person should ever have to face. I promised you then that you would only know joy from that moment on. Today, I renew that promise. As your husband, I will spend every day of my life trying to bring you happiness, to protect you, to love you as you deserve to be loved." Tears spilled onto Grace's cheeks as she responded with her own promise. "Finn, you saved me in more ways than you know. You gave me not just freedom, but a home, a purpose, and your heart. I promise to treasure that gift always, to stand by your side through whatever life brings, and to love you with all that I am for all of my days. By the power vested in me," Reverend Johnson proclaimed after they had exchanged rings, a simple gold band for Grace that Finn had ordered specially from Helena, and a matching one for him that had been his father's, saved by a family friend after the tragedy. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." He smiled warmly at the couple. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Callahan." Finn needed no further invitation. Drawing Grace into his arms, he kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar. Around them, their guests erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables had been set up near the ranch house, laden with food contributed by neighboring families. There was music, fiddles and harmonicas played by talented locals, and dancing on a wooden platform Gabriel and James had constructed for the occasion. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the valley, Finn pulled Grace away from the festivities for a moment of privacy. "Happy, Mrs. Callahan?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly, reaching up to touch his face. "And you?" "I have everything I ever wanted right here," he said, his blue eyes shining with love. "My home, my land, and now my wife." Later, after the guests had departed and family had retired to their quarters, James and Sarah in the newly renovated bunkhouse, Harold and Elizabeth, in the spare room of the main house, Finn carried Grace across the threshold of their bedroom. What followed was a tender, passionate consummation of their vows, two people becoming one in the most intimate way possible. Afterward, lying in Finn's arms as moonlight spilled through the window, Grace reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of despair on that auction platform to the heights of joy in her husband's embrace, it seemed almost miraculous. "What are you thinking about?" Finn asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "About that day in Silver Creek," she replied. "About how close I came to a very different life." Finn pulled her closer. "I thank God every day that I was there. Do you remember what you said to me when you cut my bonds? That from that moment on you'd only know joy," Finn recalled. Grace smiled, pressing a kiss to his chest right above his heart. "It was a bold promise. One I intend to keep," he said seriously. "You already have," Grace assured him. "You've given me more joy than I ever thought possible." As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, Grace felt a profound sense of peace. The past, with all its pain and loss, had led them both to this place, this moment, this love. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The years that followed proved that Finn's promise was not just romantic words spoken in a moment of compassion. Though life brought its share of challenges, harsh winters, cattle diseases, the occasional dispute with neighboring ranchers, it also brought immeasurable joy. Their first child, a son they named William after Grace's uncle, was born exactly 1 year after their wedding day. Sarah, who had delivered a healthy daughter just weeks after the wedding, became Grace's closest friend and confidante as they navigated the joys and trials of motherhood together. 2 years later, Grace gave birth to twin daughters, Fiona and Elizabeth, named for the women whose absence had shaped both their lives. Watching Finn cradle his daughters, seeing the mixture of joy and healing in his eyes as he whispered their names, Grace knew that the circle of love and family they had created was helping to heal old wounds. The Callahan Ranch prospered under their joint care. With the profits from successful cattle sales, Finn was able to purchase adjacent land, expanding their holdings just as he had once dreamed. Grace, drawing on her education from Boston, kept meticulous records and suggested improvements that increased their productivity and profit. Gabriel remained with them, eventually building his own small cabin on the property and becoming like an uncle to the children. Other hands came and went with the seasons, but the core of the ranch remained the family Finn and Grace had built together. They never forgot how their story began. Each year on the anniversary of the day Finn had found Grace on that auction platform, they would ride together to the great pine tree in the meadow. There, they would renew their private vows to each other, remembering the path that had brought them together and celebrating the life they had created. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat beneath the pine tree watching their children play among the wildflowers, Finn took Grace's hand in his. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question he posed every year on this day. And as she had 9 times before, Grace shook her head and smiled. "Not one," she replied, leaning against her husband's strong shoulder. "You kept your promise, Finn Callahan. You truly did. From tears to joy, that's the story of my life with you." Finn's arm tightened around her as they watched William help his little sisters gather flowers for crowns, their laughter carrying on the Montana breeze. Around them, the land they loved stretched in all directions, a testament to hard work, perseverance, and the power of love to transform lives. "And may it always be so," Finn murmured, pressing a kiss to his wife's temple. "For all our days to come." In the golden light of the setting sun, their silhouettes merged into one, the Cowboy, and the woman he had saved, bound together not by ropes or auction blocks, but by a love that had begun with a promise and grown into a lifetime of joy.